It is August 2nd, 2007, a coastal resort town in northern Poland called Sopot. The sun is still up at 7 in the evening, the Baltic Sea is flat and gray on the horizon, and inside a tournament tent at the Sopot Open, a match is falling apart in ways that nobody can fully explain. Nikolai Davydenko, ranked 5th in the world, is on the court. He is 26 years old. He is at the peak of his career. He has the kind of game that humbles other professionals. A vicious baseline style, a backhand that opponents describe as almost unfair, a mental resolve that has carried him to the top 5 on a tour full of generational talent. He is playing Martín Vassallo Arguello, an Argentine ranked 87th in the world, who, by any conventional analysis, should not be troubling Davydenko at all. Davydenko wins the first set. Routine. Expected. The kind of outcome bookmakers had priced as a near certainty. Then something shifts. By some accounts, the crowd began to feel it before the statistics caught up. A stiffness in Davydenko's movement, a reluctance in his racket preparation. Small things, the kind of things that coaches notice and casual fans don't. Vassallo Arguello takes the second set. The match moves into the third. And then, at a moment with no obvious physical incident, Davydenko stops playing. He speaks to the chair umpire. He withdraws from the match. He cites injury. Martín Vassallo Arguello, ranked 87th, has beaten the 5th best player in the world. Back in the United Kingdom, inside the operations center of Betfair, one of the world's largest betting exchanges, analysts are looking at numbers that have already made several of them very uncomfortable. The volume of money wagered on this match is extraordinary. Not just large by the standards of a mid-level tournament, enormous, inexplicable. Over the course of that one match, nearly $7 million in bets have passed through the exchange. Most of it, a crushing, imbalanced, lopsided majority of it, was placed on Davydenko to lose. The world's 5th-ranked tennis player, a heavy favorite, lost to a man ranked 87th. And someone, or some group of someones, knew it was going to happen before it did. This is the story of Nikolai Davydenko, the match that shook professional tennis to its foundations, the investigation that followed, and the shadow world of sports betting corruption that was operating in plain sight, in plain daylight, on courts that millions of people watched and trusted. This is the story of what happens when the integrity of a sport becomes a commodity. And it all began, as these things often do, long before anyone was looking. Nikolai Mikhailovich Davydenko was born on March 2nd, 1981, in a city called Severodonetsk, then part of the Soviet Union, now in eastern Ukraine. It was an industrial city, the kind of place built for function rather than beauty, where chemical plants and factories were the economic backbone and leisure was a secondary concern. His father, Mikhail, was a football coach. His mother, Valentina, worked in manufacturing. They were not wealthy. They were not connected. But they recognized early that their younger son had something unusual, a quality of physical coordination and competitive focus that seemed out of proportion to his age. Davydenko began playing tennis at 6 years old. His older brother, Eduard, was also a player, and by some accounts it was Eduard who first brought a racket into the household. But it was Nikolai who took to the sport with something approaching obsession. In a country where tennis was not the dominant sport, where football and athletics commanded the serious resources and the serious attention, Nikolai and his family made an unusual bet. They bet on the sport that offered him the clearest path. When he was 14, the family relocated to Oberhausen, Germany, chasing better training facilities and coaching infrastructure. This was not a comfortable or glamorous move. It was a sacrifice. They were starting over in a foreign country, in a foreign language, in a system that had no particular obligation to welcome them. But Nikolai had a coach in Germany who recognized immediately what he was working with. A player who could grind, who could endure, who could absorb punishment and return it with interest. By the time he turned professional in 1999, he was 18 years old and already showing the traits that would define his career. Not explosive, not showy, Davydenko was, in the estimation of many who watched him develop, the most complete baseline player of his generation below the very top tier. And for several years in the mid-2000s, he competed at that top tier consistently. He reached the world number 3 ranking in 2006. He had wins over Roger Federer, over Rafael Nadal, over virtually everyone on the tour at various points. He was not a flashy champion. He won tennis matches the way a craftsman builds furniture, methodically, precisely, with a kind of quiet authority that didn't generate headlines but accumulated results. He arrived at the 2007 Sopat Open as one of the most respected professionals in the game. He was earning prize money in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per tournament. He had endorsement income. He had a career trajectory that pointed upward. And then came the match in Sopat. And then came the questions that no one inside professional tennis really wanted to ask out loud. The betting irregularities that Betfair identified on August 2nd, 2007, did not emerge from nowhere. To understand what the analysts were seeing, you need to understand how a legal betting exchange works, and more specifically, how its unusual structure created, without anyone quite intending it, one of the most powerful fraud detection systems in the world of sports. A traditional bookmaker sets the odds. A customer takes the bet. The bookmaker wins if the customer loses. Simple. But a betting exchange like Betfair operates differently. It is a marketplace. Customers bet against each other. One person backs an outcome. Another person lays it, meaning they bet against it, taking the bookmaker's role. The exchange takes a small commission from the winner. This structure means that enormous volumes of money on unusual outcomes create visible patterns. If someone is betting heavily on a favorite to lose, those bets have to be matched by someone on the other side. When the sums are large enough, the market moves, the odds shift, and those shifts can be tracked in real time, with timestamps, with account identifiers, with geographic data. What Betfair's analysts saw on August 2nd was not ambiguous. The volume placed on Davydenko losing the match was wildly disproportionate to his ranking, his form, and the historical patterns of the tournament. These were not casual bettors following a gut feeling. These were large, structured bets placed with what appeared to be considerable confidence about the outcome. When Davydenko retired from the match and Vassallo Arguello claimed the win, Betfair did something that had never been done before at that scale in professional tennis. They voided all bets on the match. Everyone. Returned the stakes to every customer. And then they reported everything. Every transaction, every account, every data point, to the Association of Tennis Professionals. The investigation that began in the days following that match would last 14 months. Davydenko was interviewed. His team was interviewed. Tournament officials were interviewed. Financial records were examined. Phone records were subpoenaed in multiple jurisdictions. The ATP brought in external investigators. And the question at the center of it all was a simple one, with enormously complicated implications. Had Davydenko deliberately lost that match? He denied it categorically. He said he had been genuinely injured. He said the retirement was the only responsible choice given his physical condition. He said he had no knowledge of the betting patterns and no involvement with whoever had placed those wagers. But here was the thing that made the investigation so difficult, and so important, and so emblematic of the deeper problem inside professional tennis. Davydenko may have been telling the truth. He may have been an innocent man caught at the center of a storm he did not create. Or he may not. And for 14 months, investigators worked with the tools they had to find out which. By the time the ATP announced its findings in September of 2008, the conclusion was, in a narrow legal sense, definitive. The charges against Nikolai Davydenko were dismissed. Investigators found insufficient evidence to establish that he had manipulated the outcome of the match. He was cleared. He returned to the tour. He continued his career. But the investigation left something behind, a residue of unanswered questions, and a growing, undeniable awareness that professional tennis had a corruption problem that had been present for years and that the Davydenko match had simply brought into the light. To understand the scale of what had been building beneath the surface, you need to step back from the Sopat incident and look at the broader landscape of professional tennis in the early 2000s. Tennis is a structurally unusual sport for gambling. It is one-on-one. There is no team to coordinate. There is no coach on the court during play. There are no substitutions. There are no timeouts in most formats. A player on their own makes every decision, whether to push forward on a point or allow it to slip, whether to serve at full pace or hold something back, whether to manage an apparent injury as performance or retire from the match. The scope for a single individual to control the outcome is greater in tennis than in almost any other major professional sport. And the sport, uniquely, produces a vast number of matches at a vast number of levels. Wimbledon, the US Open, the French Open, the Australian Open. These are the events the public knows. But beneath them sits an enormous pyramid of smaller tournaments. The ATP 500s, the 250s, the Challengers, the Futures, events played in smaller cities, sometimes in front of almost no crowd at all, often involving players ranked in the hundreds or thousands who are barely covering their travel costs and prize money. These players are not wealthy. Some of them are earning less than $20,000 a year from the sport, while carrying the expenses of coaching, travel, equipment, and entry fees. A player ranked 250 in the world is still, by any measure, a professional athlete of serious accomplishment. They have dedicated their life to the sport, but they are financially precarious in a way that a player ranked 50 is not. And that precariousness, that gap between the elite and everyone else, created conditions that criminal betting networks were, by the mid-2000s, actively and systematically exploiting. The mechanism was not complicated. A bettor or syndicate approaches a lower-ranked player before a match. The conversation is quiet, indirect, often framed as advice rather than instruction. The player is told that certain parties are interested in the outcome of their upcoming match. A number is offered, sometimes $50,000, sometimes $20,000, sometimes less, sometimes considerably more, depending on the match, the tournament, the odds available in the market. The player is instructed to lose, or sometimes simply to lose a specific set, or to fail to cover a specific handicap. Specific details are sometimes left to the player's discretion. The result is what matters. Some players refused. Some players reported the approach to tournament officials. But by 2007, by 2008, investigators were beginning to understand that some players had not refused, that some had accepted, that this had been happening quietly, persistently, across multiple tour levels, across multiple years, across multiple countries. The Tennis Integrity Unit, the body established by the sports governing organizations specifically to address this problem, was not yet fully functional in 2007. It was created in response to the Davydenko case and the wave of public attention it generated. Before it existed, the mechanisms for catching, investigating, and punishing corruption in professional tennis were, by later assessments, wholly inadequate. By the time the International Tennis Integrity Agency, the successor body to the Tennis Integrity Unit, established in 2021, with broader independence and greater resources, began publishing its investigation outcomes publicly, the picture that emerged was far larger than a single match in Sopat in 2007. There was the case of Yevgeny Korolov, a Russian professional who in 2010 accepted a 6-month suspension after an investigation found he had failed to report approaches from match-fixing syndicates. He was not found to have fixed matches himself, but his failure to report was a violation, and the manner in which those approaches had been made, the precision of the financial offers described in the investigation documents, told investigators something important about how organized and experienced the syndicates attempting to penetrate the tour had become. There was the case of Dmitry Tursunov, not for any wrongdoing of his own, but because his name appeared in a broader investigation as a player who had been approached, a detail that illustrated how indiscriminate the syndicates had become. They were not only targeting the vulnerable, they were testing the waters with established players, seeing who might be susceptible, building a picture of the tour's corruption landscape from the inside out. And then there was the architecture of the betting networks themselves, the people placing the wagers, not the players tanking the matches. The syndicates that investigators eventually traced back through financial records and exchange data were sophisticated operations. They were not independent gamblers or amateur criminals. They were organized groups with access to considerable capital, with contacts across multiple sports betting markets, with the ability to split large bets across multiple exchanges and multiple jurisdictions to avoid the pattern detection that Betfair's system had so effectively deployed in the Davydenko case. They operated across Asia, particularly in markets where regulatory oversight of sports betting was limited or non-existent. They used layers of intermediaries, agents, fixers, couriers, to maintain distance between the money and the matches. Investigators who worked on these cases in the years following 2007 described the networks as comparable in structure, if not in scale, to organized crime operations in other industries. There was hierarchy, there was discipline, there were consequences for participants who failed to deliver. The players at the bottom of this structure, the ones on court, the ones physically executing the corruption, were, in many respects, the most exposed and the least protected. Consider what it meant for a player ranked in the 300s to receive an approach. He is 24 years old. He has been professional for 4 years. He is traveling between challenger tournaments in cities he has never visited, staying in budget hotels, eating on a per diem that barely covers his nutritional needs as an athlete. His ranking has stalled. He is not improving. The window of his career is beginning to feel finite. And a man he has met twice, through a mutual contact, tells him that $25,000 will be deposited into an account of his choosing if his next match ends in the first set. $25,000 is more than he will earn in prize money in the next 3 months. It is the kind of money that solves immediate problems: debt, family obligations, the costs that have accumulated during a career spent chasing a dream that is beginning to feel unreachable. And the ask is, in the framing of the man making it, almost trivial. 1 set, that is all. 1 set played a little slower, a little less urgently. Who will know the difference? Some players said yes. The International Tennis Integrity Agency's published records of sanctions and bans tell this story in aggregate. Between 2007 and 2024, dozens of players, most of them ranked outside the top 100, many of them outside the top 500, received bans ranging from 1 year to life for corruption offenses. The bans detail match fixing, set fixing, game fixing, and the crime that investigators found most pervasive in the early years: failure to report a corrupt approach. That last charge, failure to report, was in some ways the most revealing, because it indicated a culture of silence. A culture in which players who were approached, even those who declined the approach, said nothing to the authorities. Whether out of fear, out of loyalty to contacts who had connected them to the fixer, out of a general distrust of governing bodies, or simply out of a desire not to get involved, the silence was widespread enough to be systemic. The ITIA's investigations after 2021 began to target not just individual players, but the intermediaries, the fixers, the agents, the contacts who are the operational link between the betting syndicates and the players. This shift in focus produced some of the most significant convictions and bans in the agency's history. Fixers in several countries received bans from all roles in professional tennis: coaching, management, representation, after investigators established their involvement in connecting players to betting networks. The financial scale of what these networks were generating was, by the estimates of investigators and academic researchers who studied the market data, extraordinary. Conservative analyses of suspicious betting patterns in professional tennis between 2005 and 2015 suggested that hundreds of millions of dollars in bets had been placed on matches that showed signs of manipulation. Not all of these bets were necessarily on fixed matches. Correlation is not causation, and betting markets respond to many variables. But the density of suspicious patterns, the convergence of large volumes, unusual odds movements, and subsequent outcomes, told investigators a story that was hard to dismiss. And running beneath all of it, from Sopat to the challengers to the futures, to the quiet rooms where fixers made their approaches, was a fundamental vulnerability at the heart of professional tennis's structure. The sport had allowed an enormous financial disparity to develop between its elite and its professional base. It had produced thousands of athletes who were technically professional but economically marginal. And it had, until the pressure of the Davydenko investigation forced change, relied on integrity systems that were nowhere near adequate for the threat they faced. Davydenko returned to the tour after his clearance in 2008. He did not disappear. He did not collapse. He continued to play at a high level for several more years, reaching the ATP World Tour finals multiple times, collecting titles, maintaining his reputation as one of the most reliable performers of his generation. Whatever the truth of what happened in Sopat, and there are tennis professionals, journalists, and investigators who have held opinions across the spectrum, his career continued. But the match at the Sopat Open in 2007 had detonated something in the sport that could not be undetonated. The question it had made impossible to ignore was not whether Davydenko had cheated. The question was how many others had. By 2009, the Tennis Integrity Unit was operational with a mandate and a budget that reflected the seriousness of the problem. It began collecting and analyzing betting data systematically, in partnership with the major exchanges and licensed bookmakers. It established a reporting hotline. It began interviewing players proactively, not just reactively. It built relationships with law enforcement agencies in multiple jurisdictions. The results came slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. Players in the lower tiers began to receive investigation notices. Some cooperated, some contested, some vanished from the tour before investigations concluded. The bans began to accumulate. 3 years here, 5 years there, a life ban for a player in the future circuit who had been fixing matches for the better part of 2 years. One case, which emerged from an ITIA investigation completed in 2022, illustrated with particular clarity how the system had evolved. A player, a Russian national ranked in the 500s, whose name was withheld during preliminary proceedings but later became part of the public record, had been approached by a fixer during a challenger event in Europe. The approach was made in a parking lot, after a practice session, by a man the player had met through a mutual contact 6 months earlier. The offer was specific, $40,000, deposited across 2 accounts in 2 jurisdictions, in exchange for losing the first set of his next match to a pre-agreed score. The player did not immediately refuse. He did not immediately agree. He went home that evening and he sat with the offer for 48 hours. He thought about his debts. He thought about his family. He thought about the years he had spent training, traveling, sacrificing. And then, on the 3rd day, he called the Tennis Integrity Unit. His cooperation with investigators was extensive. He agreed to continue communicating with the fixer under the guidance of investigators. He documented the approach, the follow-up contacts, the financial transfer instructions. He sat in rooms with investigators and described in detail the mechanisms of the operation, how the bets were structured, which markets were used, how the timing of wager placement was coordinated with the match fixing itself. The fixer, when eventually located and processed by investigators and the relevant authorities, was found to be connected to a network operating across 3 countries, with documented involvement in a minimum of 12 professional tennis matches over a period of 4 years. The ITIA's published findings on the case described the network as one of the most sophisticated it had encountered in terms of its operational security, the use of encrypted communications, the complexity of the financial architecture, the careful selection of players based on financial vulnerability and ranking position. The player who had reported the approach did not receive a ban. He received, in the ITIA's formal language, an acknowledgement of his cooperation and a confirmation that no further action would be taken against him. He has continued to play on the tour. There is a specific detail from a later ITIA investigation, one that has never been fully reported outside the specialist press, that speaks to how intimate and personal the corruption could become. A player, ranked in the mid-300s, was not approached by a stranger. He was approached by his own coach, a man he had worked with for 3 years, a man he trusted with his development, his technique, his career. The coach had, without the player's knowledge, established a relationship with a betting syndicate. He had been providing information about the player's physical condition, training intensity, and mental state before matches, information that the syndicate used to place bets with extraordinary precision. When the player's performance had become too consistent to be useful, the coach had begun trying to introduce the player into the fixing operation directly, framing it as a financial opportunity and presenting it as something that other players on the tour were already doing. The player did not report immediately. He confronted his coach first. The conversation was, by his later account to investigators, one of the worst moments of his life. His coach did not deny it. He explained calmly that this was simply how a portion of the tour functioned, that the governing bodies knew more than they admitted, that the risk was minimal for everyone who participated carefully. The player fired his coach that day. He reported the approach 48 hours later. The coach received a lifetime ban from all roles in professional tennis. That story, the coach, the player, the parking lot, the conversation, is not exceptional. What made it exceptional was that it was reported. Because for every case that reaches the ITIA's published sanctions list, investigators and researchers who have studied the problem believe there are multiples that do not. Matches where a player took the money, matches where the fixer moved on and was never identified, matches that registered in betting data as anomalies and were flagged and investigated and ultimately left unresolved because the evidence, however strongly suggestive, was not sufficient for formal action. Professional tennis is a sport of extraordinary grace and competition. It produces moments of genuine human achievement that are difficult to overstate. The five-set finals, the comebacks from match point down, the rallies that seem to suspend ordinary physics. The players who have competed at the top of the game for the past 3 decades include some of the most talented athletes in human history. And beneath the surface of that achievement, in the lower reaches of the professional pyramid, in the futures tournaments in Eastern Europe, and the challengers in Southeast Asia, and the small events that draw no television cameras and almost no public attention, a corruption economy has operated for decades. Some of it has been caught. Some of it has been prosecuted. Some of it has resulted in lifetime bans for players and coaches and fixers. And some of it, an indeterminate, unknowable amount, has simply happened and gone unrecorded. The Davydenko match in Sopot in 2007 remains the single most visible episode in this history, not because it proved the most, but because it proved that the problem existed at a level the sport could no longer pretend was confined to the margins. When suspicious betting patterns attach themselves to the 5th-ranked player in the world, playing in a televised tournament, the argument that the sport's integrity systems are adequate becomes impossible to make. Davydenko retired from professional tennis in 2014 at the age of 33. His career included a world number 3 ranking, multiple Masters Series titles, and a record of wins over the best players of his generation that places him securely in the upper tier of players from that era. His name appears in the record books without asterisk. The investigation that threatened to define his legacy concluded without finding him guilty of anything. He lives quietly now. He has given occasional interviews in the years since his retirement, and his comments on the corruption issue have been measured, a man careful about what he says and what he does not say. He has described the 14 months of investigation as the most difficult period of his career. He has said that the experience changed his relationship with the sport permanently. He has said very little beyond that. The ITIA, as of 2024, has issued over 180 sanctions against players, coaches, and other tennis personnel for corruption offenses. The most recent published sanctions list includes bans from countries across Europe, Asia, and South America. The offenses range from failing to report a corrupt approach to systematic match fixing over periods of years. The longest single ban currently on the list is a lifetime prohibition. The agency has invested significantly in its analytical capabilities, working with betting operators across dozens of licensed markets to receive real-time alerts about suspicious wagering patterns. The sophistication of the system they operate today is, by most accounts, considerably beyond what existed in 2007, when Betfair's analysts spotted the Sopot anomaly and triggered the chain of events that changed the sport. But investigators who work in this space are careful about what they claim to know. The syndicates have evolved too. The use of unlicensed markets, peer-to-peer betting platforms, and cryptocurrency transactions has created new layers of opacity. The fixers have learned, over more than a decade of watching investigations unfold, where the vulnerabilities in detection systems lie. The arms race between corruption and integrity in professional tennis is ongoing, and anyone who claims it has been resolved is not paying close attention. There is a number that the ITIA does not publish, because it cannot know it with certainty. The number of matches that were fixed and never detected. The matches where everything went smoothly, where the outcome was plausible enough to generate no significant betting alert, where the player received the money, the fixer delivered to the syndicate, and the moment passed into the historical record as an unremarkable upset on an unremarkable afternoon in an unremarkable city. Nobody knows how many there were. The people who do know are not talking. What the Davydenko investigation established, beyond any argument, beyond any individual verdict, is that the infrastructure for widespread corruption in professional tennis existed and was being used. It had been built over time, tested and refined and expanded by people with money and patience and no particular attachment to the sport they were exploiting. They were not tennis fans. They were not athletes. They were arbitrageurs, treating the gap between a match's true probability and the betting market's perception of it as a commodity to be purchased and sold. The players who entered that transaction did so, in most cases, from a place of financial desperation or coercion or moral exhaustion, the kind that comes from years spent in a grind that offers the trappings of professionalism without the financial security. They were not, in the main, cynics. They were people who had made a choice they understood to be wrong and made it anyway because the alternative felt worse. That is the part of this story that does not fit neatly into a narrative of villains and victims. The player who takes $25,000 to lose a set in the third round of a challenger event in a city no one is watching, he is not the mastermind of a corruption empire. He is closer to the final link in a very long chain. The masterminds are further back, in offices and secure messaging apps, watching the odds move and counting the profit. But it is the player whose name appears in the sanctions list. It is the player whose career ends. It is the player who carries the outcome of that choice for the rest of his life. Nikolai Davydenko still follows tennis. He has appeared at events in a coaching and advisory capacity in the years since his retirement. His name, when it comes up in discussions of the 2007 Sopat scandal, tends to be accompanied by the conclusion of the investigation. Cleared. No evidence found. Case closed. He is not defined by Sopat in most retrospective accounts of his career. He is defined by the backhand, the baseline grinding, the wins against Federer and Nadal, the world number 3 ranking he achieved through years of relentless work. Whether that is justice or simply the resolution that evidence permitted is a question each observer answers for themselves. What is not a question? What the 14 months of investigation and the decades of ITI casework that followed have established beyond serious dispute is that on August 2nd, 2007, something happened in Sopat that was not a coincidence. Someone, somewhere, knew something about that match that the betting market did not. Someone placed wagers totaling nearly $7 million on the basis of that knowledge. Someone was right. The investigation found no evidence against Davydenko. It did not find the someone. That someone has never been publicly identified. The money was never publicly accounted for. The bets were voided. The match was stricken from the record. And somewhere, in a ledger that has never been opened to public scrutiny, there is an entry for a match played on a Baltic coast in August, in the fading summer light, where a crowd watched a favorite retire from a court and a fortune changed hands invisibly. And the sport of tennis looked at itself in the mirror for the first time and did not entirely like what it saw.